todas, todos. Um prazer enorme ver essa casa cheia, todos para ouvir, prestigiar Ilan Pappe. Queria, em primeiro lugar, dizer que essa conferência do Ilan Pappe é organizada pelo Centro de Estudos Palestinos da Faculdade de Filosofia, Letras e Ciências Humanas da USP. A existência desse centro há pouco mais de um ano, que se criou em meio a uma situação de genocídio, evidenciou o lugar que os estudos palestinos já conquistaram, possuem nessa universidade. Recebemos várias palestras extremamente importantes, mas acho que nenhuma como a que hoje recebemos, aquela de Ilan Pappe. Então agradecemos também aqueles que trouxeram Ilan Pappe ao Brasil, ou seja, a FLIP e a Editora Elefante. E eu gostaria então, sem mais delongas, começar chamando para a mesa o diretor da Faculdade de Filosofia e Ciências Humanas, professor Adrián Pablo Fanjul, está por aqui. Professor Adrián, por favor, ocupe o seu lugar. Gostaria de chamar o professor Jean Tipe, professor das Ciências Políticas e conselheiro do Centro de Estudos Palestinos. O centro é formado pelos 11 departamentos da faculdade e temos representantes de cada um desses departamentos dentro do centro. Professor Jean. Gostaria de anunciar a nossa representante discente, Lissa, que está na coordenação dessa mesa e vai fazer todo o suporte, depois se junta a nós. Ela está por aqui, ela estava aqui agora há pouco. A representação discente tem sido fundamental na vida do centro. E gostaria de chamar finalmente à mesa o professor Ilan Pappe, da Universidade de Exeter. Obrigada. Para abrir essa sessão, eu passo a palavra ao nosso diretor, Adrián, por favor.
Bom, muito obrigado, Arlene. Boa tarde a todas e todos. Bem-vindos à Faculdade de Filosofia, Letras e Ciências Humanas, bem-vindos à Universidade de São Paulo. Bem-vindo, professor Ilan Pappe. Welcome. É um prazer estar aqui com a Arlene, com o Jean, com todos vocês. O professor Ilan Pappe já esteve na FLIP e ouvimos já sobre algumas inquietações que a presença dele parece provocar. Inclusive, também se sabe que houve algumas certas pressões para que a faculdade não desenvolvesse esta conferência, pressões que obviamente não respondemos como tem que ser respondidas, com um simples não. Agora, interessante que, pelo menos desta vez, será algo assinado por pessoas, por alguém, porque desde que assumi a direção da faculdade, várias vezes chegam coisas como sugerindo, interpretando expressões favoráveis à causa palestina como um antissemitismo que haveria na faculdade. Então, vozes mais ou menos anônimas ou mais ou menos conhecidas que expressam essa preocupação. E é claro que nunca as coisas que são trazidas realmente podem ser qualificadas como antissemitismo. É impossível formular que haja, digamos, que a faculdade seja um espaço de tolerância ao antissemitismo. Na faculdade existe um Centro de Estudos Judaicos há mais de 60 anos, temos um dos poucos cursos de hebraico do Brasil, e não com isso quero dizer que há uma identidade entre língua, povo, nação. Não estou entrando nessa discussão aqui, né? Mas chegamos. Precisamente essa banalização da ideia de antissemitismo, como que toda condenação a ações do Estado de Israel, a ações criminosas, como aqui temos visto nos últimos anos e bastante antes, seja identificável como antissemitismo, me parece que é algo que, enfim, é muito importante que institucionalmente cada vez fique mais claro, né, que antissemitismo vou ler um momento da Declaração de Jerusalém, chamamos antissemitismo a discriminação, os preconceitos, a hostilidade ou a violência contra pessoas judias, entanto que pessoas judias, ou contra as instituições judias como tais, né? Coisa que nunca estava em nenhuma dos materiais que supostamente portariam antissemitismo, né? E então eu me pergunto, bom, qual é o interesse nisso, e não me parece casual, porque o que se procura é que seja imitado nas universidades brasileiras o tipo de repressão que vemos nas universidades estadunidenses desde que Trump assumiu o poder contra as expressões em defesa da Palestina. Esse, em última instância, é o objetivo, mesmo que agora não sejam eles quem estão em poder. Não casualmente, em uma das últimas, acho que a última coletiva de imprensa que deu o ex-presidente, que ontem foi, digamos, remetido
preso!
Nessa coletiva de imprensa tão nervosa, que acho que foi a que motivou a tornozeleira, ele dizia que, como de modo ameaçador, que se o governo brasileiro continuava brincando e errando e provocando os Estados Unidos, podia ter consequências, e uma das supostas brincadeiras que faria o governo seria o distanciamento em relação ao Estado de Israel e a participação na iniciativa da África do Sul de condenação a Israel por genocídio, né? Não me parece casual, como não me parece casual que repetidas vezes, isso vimos de novo no domingo, em manifestações precisamente desses setores golpistas, em manifestações pela unidade Bolsonaro-Trump, porque isso que estamos vendo hoje em dia, né? Em defesa do golpe, da tentativa de golpe de 8 de janeiro, apareçam reiteradamente bandeiras israelenses, sem que nunca as mesmas entidades que tanto se preocupam pela possibilidade de antissemitismo nas universidades digam uma única palavra em reclamação por essa utilização dessas bandeiras, né? Sim. Então, isso não me parece casual. Não quero entreter mais, digamos, não quero ocupar mais tempo, apenas reafirmar, não apenas que na nossa faculdade não prima o antissemitismo, como também que esta faculdade e a congregação dela se manifestou reiteradas vezes repudiando o genocídio contra o povo palestino, e que hoje, então, é um grande orgulho receber o professor Ilan Pappe. E queremos muito escutar o que tem a nos dizer. Obrigado.
Bom, o senhor Giante irá fazer uma breve apresentação do convidado.
Boa noite. Fico muito feliz de ver essa auditório tão cheio. E como a Arlene e Adrián falaram, é uma grande alegria receber o professor...
Mais alto.
Tá
Alguém dá um som, por favor.
Não, posso ficar mais perto também. Está melhor agora? Tá. O problema era meu. Fico muito feliz de ver essa sala, esse auditório tão cheio. Eu acho que isso que faz a universidade ser vibrante, né? Coisas como encontros como esse. E como a Arlene falou, e também a Adrián depois, é uma grande alegria receber o professor Ilan Pappe. Ele é historiador, né, se formou na Universidade Hebraica de Jerusalém, em Oxford, no Reino Unido. Né? Foi professor de ciência política na Universidade de Haifa. E com o desdobramento dessa monumental obra, né, que eu acho que é um dos melhores livros que eu li, ele acaba sendo expulso de lá e vai assumir o Centro Europeu de Estudos Palestinos em Exeter, no Reino Unido. No Brasil, né, teve essa publicação, né, pela Sanderman do Limpeza Étnica. Depois também saiu, se não me engano, pela Tábula, né, os 10 Mitos Sobre Israel. E agora a Elefante trouxe 2 livros importantes, né, o Brevíssima História do Conflito Israel-Palestina e a Maior Prisão na Terra, na prisão do Mundo, que está tudo lá na intradinha. Né? E o que eu acho que é importante também do Ilan é uma coisa que o Walt Whitman, o poeta estadunidense, falou sobre a poesia, que a poesia dele, a que faz sentido para ele, é a que dá coragem para as pessoas escravizadas e causa horror aos déspotas. Eu acho que é esse tipo de ciência que o Ilan Pappe encarna.
Thank you, the Dean. Thank you, the organizers. Thank you for your very kind introduction. Thank you for the simultaneous translations. Thank you, all of you, for coming here, especially those of you who are not in the best comfortable place in the auditorium. I hope I will make it worth your while, even if you are standing and you're a bit squeezed there. Next time we will try and get a bigger hall, I hope. What I would like to do tonight in this talk is to claim something that I'm sure many of you are aware of, but I think is very important to address. And this is the historical context of what we are witnessing in Palestine and Israel in general, and in the Gaza Strip in particular, in the last 2 years. You may remember that immediately after the Hamas attack on the 7th of October 2023, the United Nations General Secretary Guterres said that he condemned the attack, but immediately added that we have to remember that this was not done in a vacuum. What he meant, that there was a context to the attack. Israel immediately reacted by demanding that he would be removed from his position. And not only that, the Israeli government, the Israeli Foreign Ministry, its academics put pressure, especially on universities in the world, not to mention the word context, and the historical context, when referring to the events of the 7th of October or after the 7th of October. In some universities in the world, it became really absurd, such as in Germany, when there was an official letter sent to academics asking them not to use the word context. In other places, it was less official and maybe less outrageous, but it was hinted that this is something that irritates very much the Israelis, that you can only talk about what happened on the 7th of October, condemn it, and that's it. And from that, you should infer your moral position, your political position, and so on. So ironically, in many cases, when we are talking about the historical context, when we are saying historians are important for understanding what goes on today in Israel and Palestine, I would say are important for understanding what will happen, and maybe even what should happen in Israel and Palestine. It's quite ironic that it's regarded in certain places, because of the Israeli lobby, as something which equates anti-Semitism, support for terrorism, and Holocaust denial. But of course, we are in a university, and this is our job as historians, to give a context. This is not a revolutionary action on our behalf. It's not a subversive action. This is not meant as a racist action against anyone, and definitely it has nothing to do with anti-Semitism or Holocaust denial. It is something that only we can do, because the media doesn't have the space and the time and the patience to explain historical context, and the politicians are even less interested in such explanation. So this is our role, this is our obligation, is to talk about this context. And the fact that Israel is so worried that we should do it tells you that if we do our job correctly, if we tell that history as we should tell that history, the fear of Israel is that people might still not justify everything what the Hamas has done, but would understand where the outrage came from, where the anger came from, where the violence came from, but will also understand, which is no less important, why Israel reacts the way it reacts ever since the 7th of October through a campaign of genocide. Otherwise, why should they worry of us talking about history? So let's remind ourselves of that historical context this evening and try to provide something that is very necessary, even for those of us who think that they know already a lot of what's happening there, and of course for those who are, and there are many of those in the world, who became interested in Palestine only because of what happened in the last 2 years. There is a wider historical context. There is an historical context which really takes you to the very beginning of the Zionist project in Europe, and later to the Zionist project in Palestine. This is not a distant event that has no relevance for us, and we are only talking about it because we are intellectually interested. No, this is a formative period that helps to understand a lot of what goes on today and what might happen and should happen as well in the future. We have to remember where came the idea that the Jews of Europe, and Zionism only referred to the Jews in Europe in its very beginning, where came this idea that the best place for the Jews in Europe in the late 19th century, in the time of enlightenment, in the time of the emergence of democracy, where came the idea that the best place for the Jews of Europe, who are Europeans and have been Europeans for centuries, the best place is in the middle of the Arab world, in a country called Palestine, without consulting the people of Palestine whether they are thrilled by the idea of receiving all the Jews from Europe because Europe thinks that this is the best place for them. And why did Europe, and here when I say Europe, I mean European politicians, European intellectuals, European ideologues, why did they come up with this idea? Because they felt they cannot accept the Jews of Europe as equals. Some of them could not accept them because they were racist and nationalist. Others, and this is important to mention, were evangelical Christians who thought that the historical role of the Jews was not to be in Europe, but to go to Palestine, so that this would precipitate the coming of the Messiah, the resurrection of the dead, and the end of time. So a mixture of anti-Semitism and religious evangelical Christianity was putting forward this idea to the Jewish community. We're sorry, in a way. You will never be accepted as pure Europeans. So what about this idea? We will help you to build a Jewish state. Of course, one can understand why they pointed to Palestine, both as Christian and as Jews, because of the biblical connection. But it's not surprising that the vast majority of the Jews in Europe, when this idea was for the first time publicized, were not excited about this. They wanted to stay in Germany, they wanted to stay in Poland, they wanted to stay in Russia. They felt part of these countries, part of this civilization. They saw no reason to go all over the world to a country they had no idea what's going on there. The language spoken there was alien to them. And although they talked about the Holy Land, as Christians talked about the Holy Land, it was a religious place, not a geographical political place. But it did attract enough number of intellectual Jews and Jewish leaders that really came to the conclusion, and one should say this was the right conclusion, unfortunately, that in many parts of Europe, Jews will not be safe. And of course, what happened in the Second World War proved that they were. That not only would they suffer from anti-Semitic legislation, pogroms, and persecution, they might suffer from real extinction, which indeed is what unfortunately happened in Europe in the Second World War. But the incredible thing is that most of the Jews still at that moment, and quite a lot of other people, were asking themselves, is this really the best way to deal with anti-Semitism? To take the European Jews out of Europe and build a European state for them outside of Europe. The reason this idea that was not very practical in many ways and had a lot of moral problems, the reason it became a project was because it also caught the eyes of the British Empire. As you probably know, Palestine until the end of the First World War was part of the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Turkish Empire. Britain, during the First World War, was still a very imperialist power, wishing to expand its influence of the world into the Arab world. And in many ways, because many of the British leaders during the First World War, including the Prime Minister of Britain, David Lloyd George, were themselves very religious in those days. They also wanted Palestine not only as a new trophy, a new addition to the British Empire, but even some of them thought also in religious terms. As General Allenby, who occupied Palestine in the First World War, defeated the Turks and took Palestine by force. When he entered Jerusalem, he said, "I'm bringing back the glory of the Crusaders," those European people who occupied Palestine in the 11th and the 12th century. We bring back the glory to Jerusalem. Jerusalem has to be Jewish and Christian, not Muslim. The idea of imposing a European problem on the Arab world, on the Muslim world, on the Palestinians, a problem they had nothing to do with, could only be sustained by force. Could only be sustained by force. And from the very moment the indigenous native people of Palestine understood that they are not facing an immigration of poor Jews who came from Europe because they were looking for better life, which the Palestinians would have accepted. But they are coming with an ideology that regards them, the Palestinians, as aliens, at best, as foreigners, and at worst, as people who took by force from the Jewish people back in the Roman times, the Jewish kingdom. The early Zionists were talking about the Palestinians as people who took illegally the land of Israel, and they saw themselves as taking back what belonged to them, even if that belonged to them 2,000 years ago. How it is connected to what's happening today? Because that kind of ideology, that kind of project is not unique to the Jews of Europe and is not unique to Palestine. If we think about it as a more global phenomenon, we can see its impact today. The Jews were not the only European who were not welcome in Europe. There were a lot of outcasts in Europe, people who were persecuted because of their religion, because of their economic situation, because of their culture. And as you know, they were pushed outside of Europe, and like the Jews, they were looking for a Europe outside of Europe. And they built a Europe instead of the Europe that didn't want them. And they all of them, including in Brazil, had the main problem that the Jews had in Palestine. They chose places where someone else already lived, indigenous native people. And as the late professor of settler colonialism, Patrick Wolf, used to say, when the European settlers came to non-European lands and found out that someone else lives there, he said a logic of the elimination of the native was activated. Elimination could be genocide, as happened in North America. It could be apartheid in South Africa. It could be ethnic cleansing, as happened in Palestine. But he also said something that resonates with what's happening today. He said a settler colonial move project continues either until it totally succeeds in eliminating the native people, or it fails to eliminate the native people and it finds itself in perpetual conflict with them, and bloodshed engulfs everyone involved, both the settler and the next generation, and the indigenous people and the next generation. So in many ways what we see in the last 2 years is just another cycle of the fact that Israel is still a settler colonial state that is unable to complete the settler colonial project of totally eliminating the native. There is a resistance, as always there is, by the native indigenous population, and the bloodshed is never limited to one side and never only affects one side. And this is something especially for Europe to think about. Because Europe, instead of offering the Jews, even after the Second World War, offering the Jews of Europe, when it was clear what anti-Semitism did, which is the Holocaust, instead of in 1945 to come and say to all the Jews of Europe, come back to Europe, We will build a Europe where it would be safe to be a Christian, a Muslim, a Jew, doesn't matter. We are the Enlightenment, we are the civilization of the world. Instead of saying, come back, we learned from the Second World War how to build a better world. We have a Declaration of Human Rights. We now believe only in democracy. Instead of that, they said the best way to deal with what we did to the Jews is to support even more the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine. Because in 1945, it was already clear that this is not just a project of Jewish settlers. This is a project of eliminating the Palestinians. And 3 years later, in 1948, Israel ethnically cleansed half of Palestine's population, destroyed 500 villages of the 1,000 villages of the Palestinians, most of the Palestinian towns, and massacred thousands of Palestinians in the process. 3 years after the Holocaust. And Europe knew, the European leaders, European states, including the United States, knew exactly what was happening in 1948 and decided that this is still the best idea of how to deal with anti-Semitism, allowing the Jewish state to become a fact, even if the price is the dispossession of the Palestinians. As one European politician put it, we created a small injustice for the sake of correcting a much bigger injustice. And that is never a solution. And because the message of the world in 1948 to Israel was, as far as you are concerned, as far as the Palestinians are concerned, and despite the fact that we have now a Declaration of Human Rights, despite the fact that we have created the United Nations, despite the fact that we learned our lessons from the Second World War and we will never allow the world to deteriorate in a similar way, despite that fact, we tolerate what you did to the Palestinians. We know what you did. The message to Israel was, as far as you are concerned, you have an exceptional status. Because we in Europe do not know how to deal with racism in general and racism towards the Jews in particular. This, to my mind, is the best explanation for the continued European political elite silence about the genocide. Maybe there are other explanations, strategic, economic, the role of the Israeli lobby, but for me, the most important explanation for why we cannot expect, especially Western Europe, but Europe as a whole, to take firm action against the genocide, because that would mean taking firm action against a European project. That would mean that they are condemning themselves, because they see Israel as part of Europe, and Israel sees itself as part of Europe. What they didn't anticipate in 1948, that this nephew or cousin, whatever you want to call it, of the European family would be such a bad member of the family. That they didn't expect that they would have to face this kind of Israel. They hoped somehow, or they wanted to believe, the liberal Zionists, that despite dispossession, ethnic cleansing, Israel would still be a democracy, would still be part of the European value system. They find it very difficult in the last 2 years to find the value system in the way Israel behaves, not only towards the Palestinians, but also towards its own society. So I think that is one context which we have to discuss, which is the essence of Zionism as an ideology. The basic idea of Zionism, that anti-Semitism can be solved only by imposing a European state on the Arab world at the expense of the Palestinians. It's not practical, it's not moral, but it's working because there is a very powerful alliance that believes that this project serves its own interests. This alliance is much smaller than it used to be, because it's not that easy to support Israel anymore, And I'm optimistic because I think, unfortunately, the way Israel progresses will make this alliance even smaller in the future. Now, there is a more recent context. And this is something, again, we should talk about as historians because it helps to understand especially the situation in the Gaza Strip. And this goes to the fact that not many people are aware that there was no Gaza Strip before 1948. The Gaza Strip, the strip, is an invention of Israel. Gaza was a small town with a lot of nice villages around it, on the road between Egypt to Turkey, a very cosmopolitical place where Jews, Muslim, and Christian lived in the same place. And Israel in 1948, when it began to massively expel the Palestinians, it was looking for destination for the expulsion. So it expelled the Palestinians of the north to Lebanon and to Syria, and expelled the Palestinians in the center of Palestine to Jordan and the West Bank. But there was a problem with the Palestinians in the south, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, because Egypt did not allow Israel to push the Palestinians into Egypt, into the Sinai Peninsula. So the Israeli politicians said, if we can't push them into Egypt, we will create for them a small strip. We'll push them into this, and created a strip which was the biggest ever mega refugee camp in the world. 260 square kilometers, and they pushed hundreds of thousands of people into that Gaza Strip. 70% of the people who live in Gaza today are descendants of those who were pushed into the Gaza Strip by Israel in 1948. There's another chapter in this. Many of those who were pushed lived in villages and towns that were destroyed in 1948, and on the ruins of these villages and towns, Israel built a settlement that some of them were attacked by Hamas on the 7th of October 2023. It doesn't justify what they did in those Jewish settlements, but it also explained the way they perceived these settlements as built on the ruins of their own, the villages of their grandparents, and sometimes even of their parents. This is a very important part of the history we should remember. The last historical perspective is more recent, and it begins with the occupation of the Gaza Strip in 1967 and the occupation of the West Bank. Because the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948 was incomplete, Israel expelled only 50% of the Palestinians and took over only nearly 80% of historical Palestine. So half of the Palestinian population still remained in Palestine, and there were still areas of Palestine that were not part of Israel before the June 67 war. Like any settler colonial project, it has two dimensions, geography and demography, space and population. So Israel wanted more space to have the whole of historical Palestine, but like settler colonial movements in the past, they had this problem, like when the Americans moved more and more to the west, to the western coast of the United States. The more you take territory, the more you get the population you don't want. And that's what happened. In 1967, they got a larger number of Palestinians under the rule than they had expelled originally from Palestine in 1948. And in the book that Elefante published, The Biggest Prison on Earth, I used the Israeli cabinet minutes to show that in 1967, the Israeli government for a moment said, in order to solve this problem, to have the territory without the people, maybe we should do what we did in 1948, namely expel the people of the West Bank and expel the people of Gaza. But then they decided against it because they understood that the historical circumstances in 1967 was very different from 1948. You could not rely on the world to say, okay, you can do it again. 48 was very unique in that respect. So they came up with an alternative idea. What do you do with millions of people that you want the territory they live on? You decide not to expel them, but you don't want them to be included in your demography, because you believe that the only true democracy is a Jewish democracy. Jews always have to be the majority, otherwise there's no point in a democracy. So what do you do if you don't expel them? Then came the idea that was devised by the Israeli ministers of defense, Moshe Dayan, the Israeli Minister of Agriculture, Yigal Allon. All of these people in 1967 were ex-generals from 1948. They were very young generals in 1948, in the 20s. Now in 67, in the 40s, they became politicians. And they said, we have a solution. We will create the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as a mega prison, where we can control the people. We will not give them the right to vote. We will not give them the right to be elected. We will give them no say in their own future. And we will let them live their life if they are willing to accept our strategy. And our strategy is that parts of their land will be taken by us to build Jewish settlements. And part of their rights would be taken from them in order to secure our sense of defense. But otherwise, you know, they can go along with their daily life. Of course, this was not accepted by the Palestinians. Who in the world would accept to live in a mega prison? So the inevitable already started in 67, 68, the first Palestinian attempt to fight against the occupation. So there came another border. Okay, if you don't like the mega prison we offered you in 67, we will suggest a worse kind of prison with a lot of punishment. You will be punished for not accepting what we suggested. Punishment meant imprisonment without trial, meant demolishing of houses, meant allowing the settlers to expel, allowing the settlers to do their own violent attacks on the Palestinians, arresting people, deporting people, punishing collectively villages and towns with closures and curfews, in fact violating every law in the book of international law in order to punish the Palestinian people for unwillingness to live as inmates without any basic civil rights and human rights in the biggest prison on earth, as I call it, both in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And this continued from 67 until 2023. So part of what we saw, the outburst in both in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, is the outburst after living for 57 years in a condition no other people in the world have ever experienced. To be at the mercy of the military that can do whatever it wants to you, at the mercy of settlers, not having any normal life, not able to know whether you will make it to your job, to your university, to your school, to your field, and being all the time under the sense of danger when you cross a checkpoint. You don't know if you will make it to home or you will disappear in an Israeli prison. The mega prison of the West Bank was bad enough. And somehow Israel succeeded in convincing its allies in the West that this is a temporary arrangement. The Israelis always like to say, peace is around the corner if there would be anyone we could talk to on the Palestinian side. But unfortunately, there's no one we can talk to on the Palestinian side, and therefore we have to maintain this kind of rule. And It was very convenient to the United States and the West to say, okay, that makes sense, so we're not pressuring Israel to change its policy towards the Palestinians. And then came the first Palestinian uprising, the Intifada in 1987, then came the second Palestinian uprising in 2000. In between that, we had so-called peace process, like the Oslo peace process, which was not a peace process. This was an attempt by Israel allies, such as Norway, to sell to the world the prison as a peaceful solution. And the Palestinians rightly rejected it when they understood there was no genuine wish either by Israel or the mediators to really allow them freedom and liberation from the mega prison that Israel built for them. And while Israel continued to succeed with this policy of punishment and giving some privileges and then punishment and privilege, really like the relationship between a jail and its inmates in the West Bank, it didn't work in the Gaza Strip. It didn't work in the Gaza Strip for two main reasons, I think. First of all, Israel could not convince enough Jewish settlers to go to the Gaza Strip. While 800,000 Jewish settlers went to the West Bank, only 5,000 Jews were willing to settle in the Gaza Strip. So Israel felt it doesn't have an important presence there. Secondly, the people of Gaza lived in the worst condition all over historical Palestine, and therefore were much more committed than anyone else to resistance. Were much more resilient than anyone. They were the heart of Palestine. The people of Gaza were the heart of Palestine. They were the heart of the resistance of Palestine. And it's not surprising that it's there in Gaza that whenever a political faction, whether it was a secular one or religious one, whether it was Hamas or it was Fatah, if it did not deliver an end to the suffering, the other faction was given the confidence of the people to try and liberate Gaza and Palestine. And this is what occurred in 2006, 2007, and the Israelis decided of another tactic. If we cannot control the jail from the inside, in the case of the Gaza Strip, we will control it from the outside. And they started the siege and blockade of Gaza since 2007. This was the worst kind of the model of prison that I was talking about. This was not anymore a prison. This was a ghetto. This was a ghetto. This was not a prison anymore. This was much worse than a prison. Since 2007, Israel decided to punish the Palestinians in Gaza for continuing the resistance to the early models of the prison, for choosing a political faction that is committed to continue the struggle against Israel instead of going along with a faction that collaborated with Israel, the Palestinian Authority. So they were punished, and when they resisted the punishment, of course, Israel reacted with something that I don't know if happened anywhere in the world. Remember, Gaza is 260 square kilometers. It's a very small part of the world. And it has the densest population, 2 million people. What Israel did when the resistance continued from the Gaza Strip is to use air force, artillery, Navy ships to bomb the people of Gaza. They dropped more bombs on Gaza than were dropped on many cities during the Second World War. I don't know if any one of you has experienced a 1-ton bomb falling, not on his house, but 3 kilometers away from his house. This, I experienced it only once. And this traumatized me for life. Now they experienced it 3 times since 2007 to 2023. Total carpet bombing by aeroplanes, by artillery, by tanks, by boats with artillery. And you know, half of the population of Gaza is younger than 21 years old. They don't know any other reality. The only reality they know is living in this ghetto that 3 times was brutally attacked with the most cutting-edge weapons that the world has. And ironically and cynically, Israel is using modern weapons against Gaza all the time because it increases the sales of the Israeli military industry. People, unfortunately also here in Brazil, people buy the Israeli weapons because they were already experimented successfully on human beings. This is, an inhumanity that, again, doesn't justify everything, but explains to us the anger, the outrage of the 7th of October. Nothing that happened there I justify, but I say, let's have this. This is even not an historical context. I think this is also a moral context. And with this I will strive to an end. Anti-colonialist movements that were engaged in decolonization never took upon themselves to have a process of decolonization that is nice, is peaceful, is through giving flowers to the colonized and asking them patiently to leave. Decolonization is an ugly process. Yeah. It's a messy process. It's a violent process because colonization is ugly and colonization is violent. So don't expect decolonization in Palestine to be an event of Quakers. This is what's happening. And this is very important to remember. And in many, many cases, anti-colonialist movement had events like the 7th of October. The FLN that fought against the French occupation of Algeria, some of the FLN people massacred families, many families, of the settlers in Oran in July 1962. People condemned rightly the massacre, but they didn't say that because of that, the FLN struggle for independence is unjustified. And there are so many other cases in history where, of course, as I say, this is a messy business. It can be very violent, also on the side of the anti-colonialist movement. But that does not delegitimize the anti-colonialist struggle. So I think what we should be saying in kind of conclusion is that if we know that history, the deeper history, the more recent history, we first of all understand that when people say that the problem is the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October, or even the Israeli genocide of Gaza, they are talking about the symptoms of violence, but not about the origin of the violence. It's like treating an illness through the symptoms, but not knowing what is the source of the illness. So it won't help the international community if its political leaders believe that what happens in Gaza now is a great concern not only for the Palestinians, and not only for the Arab world, and not only for the Muslim world, but a concern for humanity in general. They would have to deal with the origin of the violence, not with the symptoms of the violence. And in this respect, I'm afraid to say the two-state solution is dealing with the symptom of the violence and not the violence itself. The only way is to face bravely, and you need to be very brave, as those of you who are activists in Brazil would know. The only way of doing it is to face bravely and to say, we understand what Zionism meant in history. We understand the wish of the Jews at the time to be equal, to have maybe even their own nationality. But what it became on the land of Palestine is an ideology of settler colonialism, of apartheid, of racism, of ethnic cleansing, and lately genocide. And this is something we don't accept. Not because we are anti-Jewish, or in my case, self-hating Jew, not because we do not understand what happened to the Jewish people over the history and in the world, but because exactly for the same reason that we oppose anti-Semitism, we oppose Zionism. That is very important. And I think that historical context like this would force eventually political leaders in the world to say we have to admit that the Palestinians were totally ignored by us. We never asked them from the very beginning until today. We never asked them what they want, what is their dreams for the future. And in fact, they would learn that if they would talk to the Palestinians, they would find an incredible people that despite everything that happened to them in the last 140 years, they are not moved by the impulse of revenge. They are not moved by the impulse of hatred. What they want is normal life in their own homeland, all over their homeland, with all the people of the homeland, including those who were expelled. And this is something that was denied to them. And unless we face the Zionist ideology of the State of Israel, not just its policies, we will never be able to help the Palestinians to secure normal and natural life like any other people in the world. Thank you.
Muito obrigada. Muito obrigada. Muito obrigada, Ilan Pappe, por essa palestra que tanto nos explicou com tanta profundidade, com tanto conhecimento, com tanta serenidade, o que, as raízes mais profundas do que hoje vemos. E eu já tinha combinado, então, e pedido para a Lissa, eu ia chamá-la, mas que bom que a Lissa, então, conseguiu uma cadeira, porque era para a Lissa estar com a gente desde o começo, e ela não tinha uma cadeira aqui, muito gentilmente falou, vou buscar a cadeira. Então, muito obrigada, Lissa, até mesmo por buscar a sua própria cadeira. E nós vamos receber perguntas por escrito. Não vamos abrir para perguntas no microfone, até porque temos só um microfone. Então, vamos recolher perguntas por escrito. E enquanto vocês fazem as perguntas, quem está colhendo as perguntas? A Júlia, a Beatriz estão colhendo as perguntas. Enquanto isso, eu vou passar a palavra para a Lissa, que queria fazer uma brevíssima fala.
Obrigada. Na verdade, vendo a composição dessa mesa, eu até falei para a professora que eu poderia não falar, porque estamos aqui para ouvir o professor Pappe, mas a professora Arlene achou importante e agradeço muito. Na verdade, eu estou aqui representando como os estudantes também, sou representante do Centro de Estudos Palestinos, e vai ser uma fala bem rapidinha. Eu queria trazer uma passagem desse livro, Dez Mitos Sobre Israel. É um livro que a professora, inclusive, pede fichamento para os alunos da graduação, em aulas que são nesse auditório, muitas vezes. E eu vou ler uma parte do prefácio. Esse livro é de 2017. E no prefácio de 2017, Ilan Pappe diz assim, ele explica sobre o livro, que em cada capítulo desse livro ele vai desmistificar um dos mitos criados pela narrativa sionista. No final do prefácio ele diz: Nutro a esperança de que o leitor, seja ele um novato no assunto ou um estudioso veterano, encontre neste livro uma ferramenta útil. A obra se dirige sobretudo àqueles que participam dos debates sempre em voga acerca da questão Israel-Palestina. E aí, mais para frente, ele diz: estudantes e acadêmicos podem tirar proveito deste estudo. Podem tirar proveito deste estudo se tiverem se curado da grande moléstia do mundo acadêmico de nossos tempos, a ideia de que o engajamento sabota a excelência de uma pesquisa acadêmica. Os melhores alunos de graduação e pós-graduação a quem tive o prazer de lecionar e orientar eram aqueles engajados. Este livro é apenas um modesto convite aos futuros acadêmicos para que deixem suas torres de marfim e se reconectem com as sociedades em prol das quais conduzem suas pesquisas. Escrevam eles sobre o aquecimento global, pobreza ou a Palestina. Todos deveriam vestir com orgulho a camisa de seu engajamento por baixo dos trajes acadêmicos. Eu acho que dispensa comentários além, mas estar nessa mesa com essas pessoas que estão em lugares de prestígio, são acadêmicos incríveis, mas que também deixaram suas torres de marfim. Eu acho que é importante a gente na universidade não se esquecer disso, então fica o convite a todos para ler mais Ilan Pappe, porque eu acho que ele nos ensina não só sobre a história da Palestina, mas também sobre como agir. Era basicamente essa a pequena fala que eu tinha para fazer. Agradeço a oportunidade de novo. Thank you, professor. E obrigada, gente.
Ok. Bom, eu vou começar lendo, então, uma das perguntas e vão chegar mais perguntas, só alertando que a gente vai ter um limite, evidentemente, e eu vou ler as perguntas de 3 em 3, e aí o professor Ilan Pappe responde essas perguntas também em bloco, ok? Então, a primeira, quais são... Vocês têm que me ajudar com essa letra. Quais são as reparáveis mínimas? Quais são as reparações mínimas que obrigada. Quais são as reparações mínimas que o neto ou bisneto da Nakba deveria receber? Segunda pergunta. Da forma como eu vejo, tem apenas uma coisa a fazer: terminar o sistema educacional israelense. Os israelenses são ensinados a acreditar que são superiores. E a terceira pergunta, o Estado binacional da Palestina poderia exigir os dois Estados, Israel e Palestina, previamente? Uma solução direta. Entendi. Para haver um Estado binacional, deveria haver previamente 2 Estados, Israel e Palestina, ou pode ser uma solução direta binacional?
Yes, thank you. So the first question is about reparation, third generation. I think in case of repatriation or return of refugees that have been expelled, we don't need to invent the wheel. There are very clear guidelines by the United Nations. In fact, they were renewed in 2005. They are called the Pionero guidelines, named after the person who was doing the revision of these ideas. And it's very, very clear that the first option of refugees and their descendants is return. They can choose. They can choose to receive compensation instead of return, but it's their choice. Secondly, the regulation states very clearly of what can be done with the property that belong to these people and their families, what to be done to places which were wiped out and a new settlement was built on them, what to do with houses that were taken by other people over the last 77 years and so on. In other words, if you accept the principle of the right of return, if you say that this is unnegotiable and a precondition for reconciliation, the technicalities of how to do it are there. It's called, I mean, we're not in the faculty of law, we will be there tomorrow, but it's called transitional justice. Transitional justice is very common in international law, and transitional justice works in a way that allows to repair what is repairable and make sure that if it is not possible, the people are compensated. So I think the first move is the principal move to accept it as part of the future. The details may not be easy to work out, but not totally possible. The second question was about the last one.
The school system.
Education, right, thank you. Absolutely true that Israel is a very indoctrinated society. And a very important role in the indoctrination is played by the educational system. And there is a difference between the educational system in Israel up to the 1980s and then one that replaced it in the 1990s. In the 1980s, for good or for worse, the education system was trying to blend universal values with Zionist ideology that definitely was racist towards the Arabs. But people like myself, who went through that education in the 1960s, were still aware of universal values as products of the Israeli education system. I didn't get my education outside of Israel because this was a mixed educational system. I don't think they intended us to prefer democracy to Zionism. That happened in my case, but nonetheless, it had this kind of element. Since the 1990s, the Israeli education system changed, and it now explicitly educates for racism towards Arabs and Palestinians. I wrote an article in 1999 looking at the Israeli educational system. And I said the graduates of this education system in 20 years, namely around 2020, would be people who would have a very narrow view of the world. They would hate anyone who's not they. They would be very willing to use violence against other people. They would cherish racist ideologies. And I'm afraid I was proven right 20 years later. You need to deprogram an educational system. Look what South Africa did with its own educational system. It rewrote all the textbooks. In South Africa, the textbooks tell a different story in order to try and create a new generation. There are similar attempts in the north of Ireland, so this is it. The third question, I think the two-state solution is that it's not practical because of the way the Jewish settlements are spread in cities and towns all over the West Bank and Gaza. We know is hardly existing anymore. It always was not a real two-state solution. It was an idea of the more left in Israel and the world that the Palestinians would be happy with a small Bantustan like in South Africa. This is not working. It also doesn't deal with all the Palestinians, only those who live in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and not all the Palestinians in the world live in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and it only deals with a small part of Palestine, only 22% of the homeland, so it's also not moral. Therefore, I don't think it would work. I believe that the only thing is, if the Palestinians would suggest a binational state, I would go along with this. But I think the main issue up to now, that nobody asked the Palestinians what they wanted. All the so-called peace proposals were produced in Israel, Europe and the United States, and the Palestinians were asked to react. It's time for us to hear what the Palestinians want, and for what I can see, especially from the younger generation, wherever they are, they believe in a one democratic state from the river to the sea, a decolonized Palestine, free Palestine, and there's a lot of work to be done still for the Palestinians on it, that should tell us how they see the 8 million Jews who live in Israel today in such a place, how they see their connection with the Arab world, and so on. But this is the beginning of the correct pathway to the future, not the two-state solution.
Eu estou juntando temas e quando estiver repetido muito próximo eu vou ter que não ler exatamente todas. A pergunta é, o que você acredita que podemos esperar para o futuro próximo, agora que Netanyahu anunciou a total tomada de Gaza? Continuarão a matar, não obstante o crescimento das críticas internacionais? Ou pelo menos deixarão as pessoas sair? Segunda, que papel nós, judeus de consciência no Brasil, podemos ter na luta por uma Palestina livre? Relacionado a isso, o que a população de Israel, que defende a causa palestina, tem feito por ela? E ainda sobre a mobilização mundial, como você vê as mobilizações mundiais e a exigência de ruptura em relação ao governo de Israel? Qual a mensagem que você daria ao governo do Brasil sobre a questão palestina?
Thank you. If the Netanyahu government is not going to face sanctions or pressure, yes, it will continue the military operations in Gaza. It will take, as they call it, to take over the whole of Gaza as if they are not present everywhere in Gaza. They will encounter guerrilla resistance. No army in the world has ever defeated a guerrilla movement. And they will pay a price with their own soldiers. The people of Gaza will continue to pay the price of genocide and starvation. So if the government of Netanyahu is left to its own, without us in the world doing anything, I can see no dynamics that would stop it. Because this is what they want. This is what they believe that they can do. They want to create a situation in Gaza that would make life so impossible that most of the people of Gaza would pressure the world to get out. I don't think it will happen, but they will try and do it. And then they will move to the West Bank, probably with similar policies, unfortunately. As for the Jewish part of the solidarity movement, I think it's very important because Israel is using Judaism as a weapon to silence criticism on Israel. It speaks in the name of all the Jews in the world, and therefore it says attack on Israel is attack on all the Jews in the world. The best way to refute this accusation is for Jewish people themselves saying, not in my name. We don't accept it. You are not speaking on our name, and in fact, your interpretation of Judaism is not our interpretation of Judaism. For us, if you really want to be a Jewish state, You cannot perpetrate ethnic cleansing, you cannot be a colonial power, and you cannot have an apartheid system or commit genocide. Our values as Jews led us to oppose apartheid in South Africa, led us to oppose dictatorships in South America, led us to oppose racism in the United States, led us to oppose the Vietnam War. This is why we are opposing you, as Jews, because of our values, because what we believe is right. And therefore, I think this is a crucial point in the solidarity movement. It doesn't replace the solidarity movement. It doesn't tell the Palestinians what to do. It's an internal Jewish affair that first and foremost is important to the Jews themselves, not to be misused and manipulated in such a way. But I think it will have a huge impact on the success of the international community. As for the question of change, what are the Jewish people in Israel are doing? Well, unfortunately, as I said, it's an indoctrinated society. 92% of the Israelis supported the genocide. There are now many Israelis who demonstrate against the war, but not against the genocide. It's not the same thing. They don't want to see Israeli soldiers killed. They want to see the hostages coming back, and they believe rightly that Netanyahu continues the war for political reasons, not for military purposes. But unfortunately, this is not a position that cares for the Palestinians. Although the number of people that finally begin 2 years later in Israel to demonstrate not just against the war, but against the genocide has grown, but not in any significant way to change public opinion. But at least we should be happy that the numbers of these people are growing in Israel. And a lot of what Jewish people do here, and the solidarity movement in general is doing here, contributed to their idea that what the genocide that is happening is something that they should oppose as human beings and not just a political issue.
Algumas perguntas foram já repetidas, né? Como ele enxerga o governo influenciando.
Brazil is very funny in this respect. The government is a bit more radical on Palestine than 50% of the Brazilians, which doesn't exist anywhere in the world. Usually, 90% of the people are for Palestine and 90% of the politicians are against Palestine. You are confusing the picture with your president, Lula. I have the pleasure of meeting him at least 3 times, and I'm not surprised that this is his position. So I think I would, although I would argue with the government about the two-state solution, I'm not greedy. So I'm not putting pressure now on the Brazilian government to change its policy. Let's work on Europe. Let's work on the United States. Let's make them at least go as far as Brazil and Colombia. Right? And then ask them to go even further. Tell them you already did the hard part, but there's still another 50 miles that you should walk, and I hope this will happen. But right now, I'm leaving them in peace, and I'm focusing, and when I say I'm talking about in the name of the international solidarity movement, we are focusing on other political elites that are not doing what they should do, and especially Western Europe. Western Europe is complicit in the project from the beginning, is complicit in the genocide, and has the power, even without the United States, at least to stop the genocide. And they are not doing it because they are cowards in a moral sense, they are moral cowards, and because the lobby is influencing them, but especially because in Europe, as in many other parts of the world, politicians this age are made of a very poor material. They are self-centered. They see politics as an occupation, as a job, not as a vocation. And they care much more about the re-election than about the concerns of the people. Not only about Gaza, about global warming, poverty, immigration. So we hope that we will bring a different kind of politics to the world, and that would benefit Gaza and Palestine as well.
A pergunta é: como o senhor vê o papel dos acadêmicos israelenses na atual situação? E o que dizer do papel dos, ou o que os alunos... I can make the question.
Okay. Okay.
How do you assess the role of Israeli academics in the current situation? And what can students and academics here in Brazil do to help the Palestinian cause? Then, recently, countries like France, Canada, Britain announced the recognition of the state of Palestine, or potential. What do you think this state of Palestine would be if today the only thing that there is left is 10% of the West Bank and who knows the Gaza Strip? So what are they recognizing? And the other one would be related to trauma. Given that the Nakba is continuous, can we speak of a Palestinian trauma? Trauma, yeah. Given that the Nakba is continuous and it's ongoing as we speak. Just to put a little something more into there so that we can advance, I'd like to know how you keep your optimism in this situation. Yeah.
Unfortunately, the Israeli academia is complicit in the crimes of Israel, partly by actively being involved in it when it produces arms, when it offers judges to the military regime, when it is offering the doctors that treat people who are tortured, and when they go as reserve soldiers to the Israeli army. But they are also complicit by not doing anything. This does not absolve them. The fact that they don't do anything makes them as complicit as if they took an active role in the oppression. My old University of Haifa is a few kilometers from a prison where Palestinians are being tortured and imprisoned. And that by itself should have led them to be active, but they are afraid or they believe in the Zionist ideology, it doesn't matter. They deserve to be told by the world, and this comes to the second part of the question, they should be told by the academia in the world, we don't accept your behavior. We should have a tough conversation with them. We should have an academic boycott of institutions, not individuals. I don't believe in it. In fact, the BDS movement does not believe in individual boycott. But I think Israeli academic institutions should be boycotted unless they can show that they are taking an active role in resisting the genocide, the ethnic cleansing, and the oppression. Boycott is a conversation. It's not a punishment. It's a tough conversation with people who want the world to recognize them as experts on human rights, as the best people of the elite of the world. They don't deserve this position if they continue to be part of a system and a regime that oppresses and dehumanizes millions of people for more than 77 years. The second question?
Well, there's the optimism.
No, optimism was the last. Trauma was the second one. And
and also the fact that there's only 10% of the West Bank left.
yeah, that's it. We missed one. The recognition of the Palestine state. Yeah. You know, I at first was very skeptic about this whole move by the Palestinian Authority to ask countries in the world to recognize Palestine. I thought, what Palestine will they recognize? The current state of Palestine was stated in the question, stretches over a small part of the West Bank, has no sovereignty, no power, and you don't want the world to recognize this as Palestine. However, I think the situation has changed. And I think the recognition of Palestine now is not in the state of Palestine that exists today. I don't think it's even a recognition in the two-state solution, although every government that recognizes the state of Palestine say this is because we recognize the two-state solution. They do it, as I said before, because they're not willing to confront Zionism as the problem. But we are at the stage in history where the current political elite of Israel looks for ways to totally wipe out Palestine as an idea, as a country, as a nation, as a people. And therefore I see the recognition and the urgent, and I think some of these politicians at least understand that it's an urgent recognition that the world, at least on paper, I hope also in action, but at least on paper, will not allow the Palestinians to disappear as a people, as a nation, and as a country. This is for me the recognition of Palestine, and that's why I'm now supporting it, and I do think that this would have an impact in the future. Now, for the trauma, of course, this is a nation in trauma. There's no doubt about it. From the Nakba to yesterday or today. It's very interesting that Israeli psychologists and psychiatrists who do not understand fully the connection between ideology and psychology, and ideology and psychiatry. Like to say, we like to be involved with helping the Palestinians to deal with post-trauma. And as the brave Dr. Gabor Mate said, how can they deal with post-trauma when the trauma continues? You think it's post-trauma. They don't have yet post-trauma. They are inside the trauma. And trauma, and this is something that, of course, we know from the brave people who work with people in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, how children are traumatized for life, and it's just incredible that they still show resilience and optimism and dream of a different life, despite what they have gone through, that very few children in the world has gone through. And the question again comes back to the world. This is all televised. This is all in front of your eyes. And you're not doing anything. This is incredible. This is incredible, and we hope that this will change. As for optimism, you know, I don't see it as optimism as such. I think that it's realistic to believe that in the long run there are processes that produce different realities. I would never have the impertinence to go to people in Palestine and say to them, don't worry, next year will be better, or the year after the next will be better. That would be irresponsible, immoral. I cannot promise it, and they know it. And therefore I'm not optimistic, and I'm very worried about what's going to happen in 2026 and even in 2027. But I do see processes, and this is not wishful thinking, I see them as an academic, that create processes, create reality that brings me to believe that we are in the end of a very bad period. And we are on the cusp of a new period. History for me is not linear. History is cyclic. And there were terrible cycles in history. And the end of every cycle was the beginning of a better cycle. And Gaza and Palestine are the epitome. They are our symbol that the cycle, the bad cycle, would be over. When we see an improvement in the life of the Palestinians, it means not only that things have improved in Palestine, it means that the world is a better place. Also in the way it treats global warming, in the way it treats global poverty and immigration. And if I would stop to be hopeful, then I would stop to believe in humanity. I do believe in humanity. I understand all the setbacks that we are facing. Populism, fascism, a piggish kind of capitalism. I understand all these powers and all these forces. But I don't think that millions and millions of people in the world cannot do anything against it. And one of the most important, the two most important things for successful revolutions. One is imagination. Imagination is the most hopeful action of a human being. Even when you are in prison and when you are losing hope about what's happening around you, the imagination can take you to a better vision. And secondly, organization, of course. A very good organization. And I believe that we will find the way to work on it. And that gives me hope, especially my conversation, and I'm teaching a lot of young Palestinian scholars in my center in Exeter. I draw a lot of optimism from their resilience, from their quality as human beings. It's an impressive human capital that I'm sure would find the way to lead us all to a better future.
Okay, and the final questions. Yeah. Oh, that's what you wanted to tell me.
No, you wanted to sign books.
No, the final questions. No. I think Professor Ilan has really covered a large scope of topics here, and we thank you very much for that. So the final questions are, what do you think of the sentence from the river to the sea, spoken by both sides? This is the question. The river to the sea, yeah. Then there are two questions that I will put together related to Israeli society, which you have already spoken about, but this one is specifically asking if you see a radicalization of Israeli society now that people are openly, supporting a large percentage of the society what is going on in Gaza. Is this an indication of a radicalization, or has this always been there, only now it's more visible? Then, could you tell us a little bit about why you left Israel? And finally, as individuals, what could we do to help end the blockade as individuals?
Of course. The slogan "River to the Sea" first of all means recognition that there's already one state in Palestine, called the State of Israel. And it is, in most part, an apartheid state. And when people are talking about Israel from the river to the sea, and they mention Israel and not Palestine, they want to keep this apartheid state alive. If we call it Palestine, it means we want to replace the regime with democracy, liberation, and freedom. So I think this is a very clear slogan of the international solidarity movement supporting the freedom of all the Palestinians all over Palestine. And it's quite ridiculous that, for example, the German parliament, the Bundestag, has passed a resolution that if you chant Palestine should be free from the river to the sea, you should be arrested for inciting terror. So I think that's a very genuine call for freedom, and I think that it should be respected. The second question was? The radicalization. There was a radicalization. I mean, as I said, it's a settler colonial state, so getting rid of the Palestinians was always part of the project. But what we used to call the liberal Zionists, the Zionist left, hoped that if it would give up direct control of parts of Palestine, maybe it could solve the problem without the need to expel and genocide. Or maybe it could look for good Arabs that would be happy to be Zionists. Fortunately, there are some. And so I think that this is radicalization in the sense that I can understand it. Most of the Israeli Jewish population say there's no need for this game of saying that we are both democratic and ethnic or racist. In this I agree with them. They say we have to choose. Do we want to be a democracy or a racist ethnic state? We cannot be both. And we, the Jews of Israel, in large number prefer, if this is the option, and there is no third option, we prefer to be the ethnic racist state and not a democratic state. So I think that's what is happening in Israel. And finally, I think there was a final question about I don't think do anything individually. I mean, apart from, I don't know, stealing an Israeli cheese from the supermarket. But don't do anything private, like individual. I think that the power we have is in numbers, in working together. Supporting Palestine is something that needs moral courage, because you will be faced with reaction. In some countries, even with legal reaction. In some countries, with imprisonment and so on. So I think people should react very wisely in how they support Palestine, not to get too much into unnecessary trouble, and mainly work in networks. And where it's impossible to do it in your own university, in your own community, so be part of a more global community. You know, I always said, and with this I would end, I said to the German academics who are very afraid to speak openly. They don't speak openly about Palestine. I said, if you can't do it in the German universities, so do it by Zoom with us in British universities. Find a way of expressing your views without totally destroying your position in your own university. I have a small story with which I would end on a bit more humorous point of view. I think humor is something that saves us even in the darkest moment of life. I was stopped by the United States Homeland Security in the airport of Detroit a year ago. And I was interrogated for 2 hours. And one of the questions I was asked, do you believe in the slogan that Palestine should be free from the river to the sea? And I said, you know, I believe that everywhere in the world where people live between two sources of water, they should be free. Now, the homeland agent wanted to show me that he knows geography. So he said, what about Switzerland? And I said, I don't care about Switzerland. If the Swiss will not be free, I don't care. So he didn't know how to continue. So everywhere in the world where you have, like in Brazil, you have one sea. but we can make it 2C with a regular. Everywhere where people have water behind them, in front of them, between them, people should be free. Thank you.
Palestina livre do mar. Palestina livre do rio ao mar. Palestina livre do rio ao mar. Palestina livre já. 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 Do rio ao mar. Palestina livre já, do rio ao mar, Palestina livre já, do rio...
Palestina livre, muito bom.